Chapter 4. Segregation Now, Segregation Forever. How Democrats Used Laws and Lawlessness to Keep Blacks in Their Place. This is a white man's country. Let the white man rule. Official Democratic Party slogan, 1868 presidential campaign. In 1969, 21-year-old Hillary Rodham was selected to give the commencement address on behalf of graduating seniors at Wellesley College. Hillary came prepared with an address that included the familiar 1960s cocktail of left-wing idealism and pure blather. None of it is worth our attention. Here, I want to focus on what Hillary said impromptu once she had heard the speaker who preceded her. The speaker was Senator Edward Brooke, Republican from Massachusetts, and the first black senator to be popularly elected in American history. Brooke was a political moderate, as suggested by the title of his autobiography, Bridging the Divide. He had been chosen to receive an honorary degree by Wellesley that year. Upon receiving the award, Brooke spoke briefly, expressing his empathy with the idealism of young people on issues such as the Vietnam War and civil rights. At the same time, Brooks cautioned them that they should stay within the law and not engage in coercive protest, because that would risk alienating people otherwise sympathetic to their cause. Brooks' unobjectionable remarks stirred Hillary into high dudgeon, and she ascended the podium. Attempting to speak for her generation, Hillary said, "We're not in the positions yet of leadership and power, but we do have that indispensable task of criticizing and constructive protest." Responding directly to Brooke, she added, "Part of the problem with empathy with professed goals is that empathy doesn't do us anything." Hillary went on to say, "We've had lots of empathy. We've had lots of sympathy." Hillary didn't say it, but her implication was clear. "We've heard enough from you, old black man." Hillary added that her generation had been asked to wait for too long, and now it was feeling used. "We feel that too long our leaders have said politics is the art of the possible, and the challenge now is to practice making what appears to be impossible, possible." Hillary didn't say whether Brooke was a false friend using young people, or whether he was, as a supporter of Richard Nixon and the war in Vietnam, himself a case of a black man being used. The audience could draw its own conclusions about that. Hillary concluded her address by reading a poem that referred to the hollow men of anger and bitterness, who must be left behind. Senator Brooke took offense to that, recognizing it as a reference to him. Hillary's point didn't escape anyone in the audience. She and like-minded young people were ready and willing to take over the country from the likes of Senator Brooke. Hillary's speech was met with a thunderous ovation by her fellow students, and her professors enthusiastically joined in. The Boston Globe reported the next day that Hillary had upstaged Brooke. Hillary was profiled that year in a Life magazine feature, The Class of '69, that highlighted student speakers across the country. Clearly, the young star had struck a chord, and her career was on its way. Even today, young leftists claim to draw inspiration from what Hillary said more than 35 years ago, and Hillary herself has never repudiated her remarks. On the contrary, returning to Wellesley during her husband's presidency, Hillary said that her original commencement speech reflected the hopes, values, and aspirations of my classmates. Then she confessed, "It is uncanny to me the degree to which those same hopes, values, and aspirations have shaped my adulthood." Letting the black man have it. Ponder the extraordinary spectacle that young Hillary created at her graduation address. Here was a white girl, scarcely in her 20s, delivering a public scolding and a tongue-lashing to a highly accomplished 50-year-old black man. Hillary lectured him with a tone of evident contempt and from a position of presumed superiority. Yet Hillary had no accomplishments that could compare with Brooke's. Her superiority was clearly not based on anything that she had done. Where, then, did it come from? It came from history. Hillary placed herself squarely on the right side of history and, by implication, if not outright assertion, placed Senator Brooke on the wrong side. Hillary didn't quite say it, but both in her tone and in her remarks, she left the clear impression that Brooke was a kind of Uncle Tom. He was a sellout to the system, to the existing way of doing things, while she represented a moral challenge to the system. Here, Hillary did not merely assert the obvious, if tedious, truism that the future belongs to the young. Much more than that, she appealed to a progressive consensus that she could rely on. The consensus declared that left-leaning Democrats are the good guys, and Republicans, even moderate Republicans, are the bad guys. Consequently, white liberals should feel no qualms about giving it to black Republicans, fully confident that academia will applaud and the media will cheer. Let's examine the main themes and storyline of the progressive consensus. According to this storyline, America has a long history of racism that was especially virulent in the South. Although Republicans may have played an important role in ending slavery, the South basically created new institutions of racism in the postbellum period. This Southern oppression is epitomized by the Black Codes, segregation, lynching, and the Ku Klux Klan. Who, the progressive storyline continues, fought to end this oppression? The Progressive Democrats. It was a Supreme Court dominated by progressives that ended segregation beginning with Brown v. Board of Education. The Democratic Party took Martin Luther King's lead and championed the cause of civil rights, first for blacks and then for women and other minorities. A Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Johnson administration also convinced a Democratic Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Bill of 1968. Meanwhile, according to the progressive storyline, conservatives and Republicans have proven themselves the consistent enemy of civil rights. The Republican South, in particular, is the home of American racism. No wonder blacks and other minorities vote for Democrats in overwhelming numbers. African Americans and other persons of color aren't stupid. They know who their friends are. Here, in sum, is the fund of moral superiority that Hillary Clinton drew on when she gave it to Senator Brooke. The central issue, therefore, is which is the party of racism and which is the party of civil rights. The question cannot be answered simply by invoking the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. That movement was itself parasitic on an earlier civil rights movement that took place a century earlier. Didn't know there were two civil rights movements? That's because the progressives don't say much about it. They focus on the later movement and pass over the earlier one. The earlier civil rights revolution is downplayed today because it has become politically problematic. It disrupts the Progressive Party line. Even in the second civil rights revolution, however, the roots of the first one are clearly apparent. Let's enumerate the rights supposedly conferred by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The Brown decision in ending school segregation allegedly established the right of blacks to freely avail themselves of public facilities without legal restriction or prohibition. In other words, it was a freedom decision. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 famously guaranteed blacks, women, and other minorities the right not to be discriminated against in jobs and government contracts. The Fair Housing Bill of 1968 extended this anti-discrimination provision to housing. So these two pieces of legislation provided equal rights under the law. They were social justice provisions. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 guaranteed to blacks and other minorities full enfranchisement. In other words, the same right to vote that whites enjoyed. It was an equality provision. Where these rights come from. Yet, what was the constitutional basis for these actions? Desegregation and anti-discrimination laws both relied on the notion that blacks weren't slaves any longer. Rather, they were free and could make their own choices. This freedom, however, had been secured for blacks by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which permanently abolished slavery. Thus, the 13th Amendment was the original Freedom Charter for African Americans. The desegregation court rulings and the anti-discrimination provisions of the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Bill were also based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This amendment granted citizenship to blacks and established equal rights under the law. It was the original social justice manifesto for blacks, women, and other minorities. Finally, the Voting Rights Act attempted to secure for blacks full enfranchisement, the right to vote. But blacks already had the right to vote. That right was specified in the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment declared that as citizens, blacks had the same prerogative to cast their ballots as whites and all others. The 1965 Voting Rights Act merely sought to enforce an equality provision that had been constitutionally affirmed much earlier. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed in the aftermath of the Civil War. They were passed by the Republican Party. The Republicans enacted these measures then to secure the freedom, equality, and social justice that Democrats keep harping on today. To further promote these goals, Republicans also implemented a series of civil rights laws: the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. The Republican ethos underlying these landmark provisions was aptly framed by the great abolitionist Republican Frederick Douglass. Douglass said, "It is evident that white and black must fall or flourish together. In light of this great truth, laws ought to be enacted and institutions established, all distinctions founded on complexion and every right, privilege, and immunity now enjoyed by the white man ought to be as freely granted to the man of color." This was the clarion cry taken up by the GOP in the aftermath of the Civil War. Virtually all black leaders who emerged from that era were Republicans who supported the GOP's call to remove race as the basis of government policy and social action. Historian Eric Foner writes that black activists of the antebellum era embraced an affirmation of Americanism that insisted blacks were entitled to the same rights and opportunities that white citizens enjoyed. Notice that the GOP program, articulated by Douglass and affirmed by black leaders, is none other than the colorblind ideal outlined in Martin Luther King's famous Dream. King envisioned a society in which we are judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. This is substantially what Douglass and other black Republicans called for more than a century earlier. How interesting that the Democrat, Martin Luther King, is identified with a principle that the Republican, Frederick Douglass, expressed even more eloquently so much earlier. How bizarre that the Democrats are presumed to be the party of civil rights when the very content of civil rights was formulated and developed by the GOP. Very few young people know this history. Most of them haven't even heard about Douglass. Who hasn't heard of Martin Luther King? Am I suggesting that the scandalous neglect of Douglass and the excessive praise heaped on King is part of the progressive whitewash? You bet I am. But, say the Democratic and progressive historians, wait a minute. While King's program moved forward and was enacted into law, Douglass's program was halted in its tracks. We cannot forget about the backlash. Yes, indeed. The Democratic storytellers are right that there was a powerful backlash against blacks in the South, so that the constitutional provisions of freedom, equality, and social justice became a dead letter. The civil rights laws were stymied, and even the provisions that passed were ignored. Blacks were reduced to new forms of subjugation, not identical with, but reminiscent of slavery. This re-enslavement of blacks was enforced by a juggernaut of violence epitomized by that institution of domestic terrorism, the Ku Klux Klan. This part of the story is true enough. What the storytellers omit, however, is that the Democrats are the ones who caused the backlash. They are the ones who from the beginning opposed black freedom and black equality, undermining voting rights and equal treatment under the law. They were the true enemies of racial and social justice. Moreover, the Democrats did those things not just through political and legal measures, but also through domestic terrorism. Indeed, the Ku Klux Klan was a licensed instrument of terror and intimidation unleashed by Democrats and operating for the benefit of the Democratic Party. Consequently, it was Democrats who, from the 1860s through the 1960s, prevented blacks as a group from enjoying their rights through political opposition and violent acts of terror. Democrats now claim credit for allowing blacks to have the civil rights that they themselves violently prevented for 100 years. Blaming the South. Today's Democrats try to shift blame from themselves by blaming the South. The South is supposedly responsible for espousing racist views and implementing racist practices. Yet the detractors of the South neglect to point out that after Reconstruction, the Democratic Party was the dominant, almost the sole, political party in the South. One prominent Democrat, South Carolina Governor and later Senator Ben Tillman, explained how this came about. Republicanism means Negro equality, while the Democratic Party means that the white man is superior. That's why we Southerners are all Democrats. How did the South become so uniformly Democratic? Basically, the Democrats used racist ideas and practices to establish a lasting political hegemony there. So racism wasn't incidental, it was an essential part of the Democratic Party's strategy. The Democrats won the South by appealing not just to the former planter class, but also to poor whites. How did they do this? The great postbellum invention of the Democratic Party was the institution of white supremacy. After the war, writes historian George Frederickson, the one thing that held the Democratic Party together was a commitment to maintaining white supremacy. White supremacy is an elaborate ideological structure for justifying racism in the same way that the positive good school was an elaborate ideological justification for slavery. Now, I am obviously not suggesting that the Democrats invented racism any more than I am suggesting that they invented slavery. Obviously, slavery existed for a long time before the Democrats made their positive good arguments in favor of it. Similarly, racism existed long before the Democrats developed the comprehensive ideology of white supremacy. The purpose of an ideology is to reinforce a practice by defending and systematizing it. The positive good defense strengthened slavery by giving it an ideological foundation, and white supremacy did the same for racism. In fact, the supremacist ideology did more for racism than the positive good ideology did for slavery. Positive good arguments, after all, didn't create the plantation system. That system already existed, and the positive good school was simply a Southern Democratic rationalization for it. By contrast, white supremacy created a whole new set of laws and practices that became the institutional embodiment of racism. The Black Codes, Jim Crow, segregation, and a network of terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. Together, these institutions created what historians bluntly refer to as the re-enslavement of blacks. The term enslavement is an important one that will recur in this book. As I said in the last chapter, enslavement isn't slavery. It is a transmission belt for moving people in the direction of slavery. Enslaved people are not property, but they are in captivity. By historical analogy, serfs were not slaves because they weren't literally owned by their masters. On the other hand, serfs were so captive to their masters in every aspect of their lives that we can fairly describe serfdom as a kind of enslavement. Having previously specialized in slavery, the Democratic Party soon specialized in enslavement, a strategy the party employs to the present day. The institutions of black enslavement and white supremacy did not exist before Democrats in the South created them. The very same institutions then became the mechanisms that Democrats used to build their power and also to repel and defeat attempts by Republicans to extend rights and opportunities to black Americans. A new racket. After slavery, the Democrats needed something new in order to continue their tradition of theft, oppression, and power-seeking. They found a replacement for slavery in the form of white supremacy. Once Democrats were no longer allowed to buy and sell people and force them to work for free, racism and white supremacy became the preferred mechanism for Democrats to exploit black people, recruit new supporters, and secure the party's power and control in the South. But how? How did racism and white supremacy consolidate the Democrats as the ruling party of the region for nearly a century from the 1860s through the 1960s? White supremacy may be a racket like slavery, but we all know how slavery pays. It pays in the form of getting other people to work for you for free. How does white supremacy pay? What do the people who support it get out of it? Let's consider the situation facing the poor white man in the South. What does this guy stand to gain from segregation, from forcing blacks to drink from separate water fountains or to use separate restrooms? What would make a man who would seem to derive no economic benefit from it nevertheless join that institution of democratic terror, the Ku Klux Klan? To put it bluntly, what's in it for him? We can resolve this conundrum by answering a similar question that historians have raised about the Civil War. Why did poor whites, the vast majority of whom didn't own slaves, fight on the Confederate side? Of course, we know why the slave owners fought, to protect the value of their property. But how did they convince the non-slaveholding whites to join them? Seemingly, these poor whites had nothing to gain by extending the life of the peculiar institution. What, then, were they fighting for? A clue to this question is provided in an address delivered in 1860 by South Carolina planter John Townsend. Speaking on behalf of secession to a group called the 1860 Association, Townsend directly addressed the issue of how the Southern plantation system benefited whites who didn't own slaves. The color of the white man is now in the South a title of nobility in his relations to the Negro. Although Cuffy or Sambo may be immensely his superior in wealth, may have his thousands deposited in the bank, as some of them have, and may be the owner of many slaves, as some of them are, yet the poorest non-slaveholder, being a white man, is his superior in the eyes of the law, may serve and command in the militia, may sit upon juries to decide upon the rights of the wealthiest in the land, may give his testimony in court, and may cast his vote, equally with the largest slaveholder in the choice of his rulers. In no other country in the world does the poor white man occupy so enviable position as in the slaveholding states of the South. In countries where Negro slavery does not exist, as in the northern states of this Union and in Europe, the most menial and degrading employments in society are filled by the white poor, who are hourly seen drudging in them. Poverty, then, in those countries becomes a badge of inferiority and wealth of distinction. Hence the arrogant airs which wealth there puts on in its intercourse with the poor man. But in the southern slaveholding states, where these menial and degrading offices are turned over to be performed exclusively by the Negro slave, the status and color of the black race becomes the badge of inferiority, and the poorest non-slaveholder may rejoice with the richest of his brethren of the white race in the distinction of his color. The poorest non-slaveholder thinks and feels and acts as if he was, and always intended to be, superior to the Negro. A racial caste system. Here we see beautifully enumerated the social and psychological benefits that poor whites derived from white supremacy. White supremacy created a racial caste system in which the poorest meanest and stupidest white guy belonged to an aristocracy of color that elevated him above the most intelligent, decent, and productive black man. George Orwell saw the same phenomenon in Burma, now Myanmar, when he served as a colonial officer there. Relaxing at the whites-only club, Orwell saw arrogant British 20-somethings ordering and kicking around dignified Asian Indian servants in their 50s and 60s. I remember hearing similar accounts from my grandfather, who suffered the indignity of hearing white-skinned youths call him coolie and boy. My grandfather was a mechanical engineer in his 40s. As a consequence of his humiliating experiences at the hands of uncouth Britishers, he became embittered for life against white people. These uncouth Britishers, Orwell knew, were losers in their own country. They were at the bottom of the British caste system. In fact, they had been dispatched to India and Burma largely to get rid of them. In India and Burma, however, they found that their social level had been raised. As a consequence of the colonialist distinction between the ruling class and the ruled, the low men on the British totem pole became the high men on the Indian and Burmese totem pole. Suddenly, their whiteness made them members of an elite and privileged caste. They could now have fun kicking other people around. Yet, and this is the most amazing part, Orwell noticed that these very same abusive jerks would sound off to each other about how they were in India for the benefit of the Indians. Orwell termed this the lie that we're here to uplift our poor black brothers instead of to rob them. Orwell concluded that we Anglos could be almost bearable if we'd only admit we're thieves and go on thieving without any humbug. Even as an Englishman, Orwell was appalled at the condescending hypocrisy he witnessed at the Colonial Club. Yet he understood it. The young Englishmen were enjoying the twisted pleasures of aristocracy. They took pleasure in demeaning and lording it over the brown people below them, even while pretending to be magnanimous toward them, because in this way they confirmed and ratified their superiority. Precisely the same benefit that the British government offered to its white expatriates, the Democratic Party in the United States offered to its poor white supporters. From the 1870s through the 1960s, the Democrats established their political hegemony in the South by granting whites the full social and psychological enjoyments of white supremacy. Blacks paid a costly price for this because the Democrats unleashed a fury of violence against them. In fact, had the Democrats been the only political party in America, it's hard to imagine what would have become of the black population of the South. Blacks, however, had, during most of this difficult period, a single ally. That ally was the Republican Party. For nearly a century following the Civil War, the Republican Party made valiant efforts, often against near impossible odds, to protect blacks from the Democratic onslaught and to secure their basic rights. At times, these measures worked. At other times, they proved far too feeble to control the vicious racists in the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, in the long run, the GOP succeeded. Just as the founders' constitutional principles eventually supplied the necessary foundation for America to realize the principle that all men are created equal, so too the GOP-sponsored amendments of the 1860s supplied the indispensable basis for blacks in the 1950s and 1960s to overcome white supremacy and actually exercise their rights. Blacks today owe their basic rights of liberty, equality, and justice to the GOP, rights that Democrats withheld from them for almost a century. The original Civil Rights Revolution. Let's begin by examining the first Civil Rights Revolution in America, the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1860s. This was a Republican revolution, which is why progressive Democrats ignore it and pretend that the later revolution of the 1950s and 1960s is the only one. Yet of the two civil rights revolutions, the first, the ignored one, is actually more important. To see why, consider the meaning of the term civil rights. What is a civil right, and why are civil rights important? Civil rights are actually distinguished from natural rights. Imagine if you and I lived in the jungle removed from society. Philosophers call this the state of nature. In the state of nature, we would have natural rights. The right to defend ourselves, or the right to pick fruit from trees and eat it. These are rights that we have by virtue of being human. Civil rights, by contrast, are rights that we derive from society. They arise out of a social compact whose legitimacy derives from the consent of the people. While blacks were slaves, they had no civil rights. Even when they were emancipated, this merely returned them to freedom, to the state of nature. Humans have natural rights in the state of nature, but they do not have civil rights. Civil rights are derived from membership in a society. The Republicans who controlled both houses of Congress after the Civil War knew this. They also knew that before conferring civil rights, they had to once and for all abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment ending slavery was passed by the Senate on April 8, 1864, and by the House on January 31, 1865. Republican support for the amendment, 100%. Democratic support, 23%. Even after the Civil War, only a tiny percentage of Democrats were willing to sign up to permanently end slavery. Most Democrats wanted it to continue. In the following year, on June 13, 1866, the Republican Congress passed the 14th Amendment, overturning the Dred Scott decision and granting full citizenship and equal rights under the law to blacks. This amendment prohibited states from abridging the privileges and immunities of all citizens, from depriving them of due process of law or denying them equal protection of the law. The 14th Amendment passed the House and Senate with exclusive Republican support. Not a single Democrat, either in the House or the Senate, voted for it. 2 years later, in 1868, Congress, with the support of newly elected Republican President Ulysses Grant, passed the 15th Amendment, granting suffrage to blacks. The right to vote, it said, cannot be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In the Senate, the 15th Amendment passed by a vote of 39 to 13. Every one of the 39 yes votes came from Republicans. Some Republicans, like Charles Sumner, abstained because they wanted the measure to go even further than it did. All the 13 no votes came from Democrats. In the House, every yes vote came from a Republican, and every Democrat voted no. It is surely a matter of the greatest significance that the constitutional provisions that made possible the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Bill only entered the Constitution thanks to the Republican Party. Beyond this, the GOP put forward a series of civil rights laws to further reinforce black people's rights to freedom, equality, and social justice. When Republicans passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, guaranteeing to blacks the right to make contracts and to have the criminal laws apply equally to whites and blacks, the Democrats struck back. They didn't have the votes in Congress, but they had a powerful ally in President Andrew Johnson. Johnson vetoed the legislation. Now, this may seem like an odd act for Lincoln's vice president, but it actually wasn't. Many people don't realize that Johnson wasn't a Republican. He was a Democrat. Historian Kenneth Stamp calls him the last Jacksonian. Lincoln put him on the ticket because he was a pro-Union Democrat, and Lincoln was looking for ways to win the votes of Democrats opposed to secession. Johnson, however, was both a Southern partisan and a Democratic partisan. Once the Civil War ended, he attempted to lead weak-kneed Republicans into a new Democratic coalition based on racism and white privilege. Johnson championed the Democratic mantra of white supremacy, declaring, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government of white men." In his 1867 annual message to Congress, Johnson declared that blacks possess less capacity for government than any other race of people. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands, On the contrary, wherever they have been left to their own devices, they have shown a consistent tendency to relapse into barbarism. These are perhaps the most racist words uttered by an American president, and, no surprise, they were uttered by a Democrat. Outraged by Johnson's words and his veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Republican Congress sought to impeach him. The measure passed the House, but fell just short in the Senate. Just a century later, there were not enough Senate votes to remove Bill Clinton from office. The GOP was, however, successful in overriding Johnson's veto, so that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 became law over the Democratic president's objection. Furious at Republican success in passing constitutional amendments and civil rights legislation for blacks, Southern Democrats responded with the infamous Black Codes. These were approved through state legislatures and state constitutional conventions held throughout the South in the years following the war. Only whites participated in these sessions. These codes represented a new democratic form of enslavement. Some historians use the term neo-slavery. Fairly typical is the code Democrats adopted in South Carolina. Blacks were permitted to work only in certain professions, thus granting whites a labor monopoly in the remaining ones. White masters could whip young black servants. Blacks could not travel freely. If they did, they ran the risk of being declared vagrants, in which case they could be arrested and imprisoned. Sheriffs could then assign hard labor or hire them out to white employers to work off their sentence. Black children could be apprenticed to white employers against their will. In addition, blacks could not vote or serve on juries. Their testimony in court was only considered relevant in cases involving other blacks. Many crimes, such as rebellion, arson, and assaulting a white woman, carried the death penalty for blacks, but not for whites. Blacks were not allowed to sell alcohol or carry a firearm. While blacks could now marry, the code made it clear that marriage between a white person and a person of color shall be null and void. The GOP counterattack. Indignant at what they perceived as a Southern Democratic attempt to nullify emancipation, Republicans struck down the Black Codes and began the process of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was aimed at rebuilding the South on a new plane of equality of rights between the races. It wasn't easy, but essentially Congress was attempting to control the internal affairs of Southern states where the local Democratic Party mounted stubborn resistance. Even so, it's remarkable what the Republicans achieved against daunting odds. The GOP's first step in this regard was to establish the Freedmen's Bureau. At one point, the Bureau considered a reparations bill modeled on one of General Sherman's field directives. Sherman's Directive 15 provided blacks with 40 acres of land to farm on their own, plus a retired Army mule. The Bureau began to implement its reparations plan, settling blacks on the plantations that had been taken over by Union troops. Today, we hear occasional demands for black reparations, and those demands usually come from progressive Democrats. I find it interesting that these Democrats never suggest that they pay reparations for what their party did. Rather, they point the finger at Republicans when Republicans are the ones who historically supported and attempted to enact reparations. In a sense, the GOP was trying to compensate blacks for their suffering at the hands of the Democratic Party. Unable by themselves to thwart the Bureau's reparations bill, Democrats appealed to President Johnson. Johnson undercut practical efforts at reparations by issuing pardons galore so that former Confederates could recover their property that had been lost during the war. Blacks who had been granted land by Sherman or the Freedmen's Bureau were forced to return it to the former plantation owners. So the Republican reparations program died an ignominious death. The Bureau did, however, open hundreds of schools for blacks. It also provided newly freed blacks with food, health services, and legal protection, and also helped unite the families of former slaves. These measures, although insufficient, showed African Americans that their only political ally in the country was the Republican Party. The most aggressive move the GOP made under Reconstruction was to appoint military governors throughout the South. These officers had the power to override local authority. Thanks to Republican supervision, more than 1,500 blacks won federal, state, and local offices. A former slave named Blanche K. Bruce became the first black senator from Mississippi to serve a full term. John Langston became the first black congressman from Virginia. Every single one of these blacks was elected as a Republican. No surprise that these African Americans are ignored in progressive historiography. Rosa Parks is well known to young people simply because she refused to sit in the back of the bus. Actually, this was no spontaneous act. Parks had been put up to it. Her tired old black woman story was largely invented to serve the needs of progressive propaganda. By contrast, Blanche K. Bruce was the real deal. Born into slavery in Virginia, Bruce was freed by his master and studied at Oberlin College before becoming a successful farmer and landowner. He is the only former slave to have served in the U.S. Senate. His story is vastly more impressive than that of Parks. Progressive historians ignore him because he was not a Democrat. The Democrats and the Ku Klux Klan. The Democrats did play a role in Reconstruction. They worked to block it. The party struck out against Reconstruction in two ways. The first was to form a network of terrorist organizations with names like the Constitutional Guards, the White Brotherhood, the Society of Pale Faces, and the Knights of White Camellia. The second was to institute state-sponsored segregation throughout the South. Let us consider these two approaches one by one. The Democrats started numerous terror groups, but the most notorious of these was the Ku Klux Klan. Founded in 1866, the Klan was initially led by a former Confederate Army officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who served 2 years later as a Democratic delegate to the party's 1868 National Convention. Forrest's role in the Klan is controversial. He later disputed that he was ever involved, insisting he was active in attempting to disband the organization. Initially, the Klan's main targets weren't blacks, but rather white people who were believed to be in cahoots with blacks. The Klan unleashed its violence against Northern Republicans who were accused of being carpetbaggers and unwarrantedly interfering in Southern life, as well as Southern scalawags and white niggers who the Klan considered to be in league with the Northern Republicans. The Klan's goal was to repress blacks by getting rid of these perceived allies of the black cause. Once again, Republicans moved into action, passing a series of measures collectively termed the Ku Klux Klan Acts of 1871. These acts came to be known as the Force Bill, signed into law by a Republican president, Ulysses Grant. They restricted Northern Democratic inflows of money and weapons to the Klan, and also empowered federal officials to crack down on the Klan's organized violence. The Force Bill was implemented by military governors appointed by Grant. These anti-Klan measures seem modest in attempting to arrest what Grant described as an invisible empire throughout the South. But historian Eric Foner says the Force Bill did markedly reduce lawless violence by the Democrats. The measures taken by Republicans actually helped shut down the Ku Klux Klan. By 1873, the Klan was defunct, until it was revived a quarter-century later by a new group of racist Democrats. In 1902, a prominent Democratic writer, Thomas Dixon, wrote a vicious anti-black novel, The Leopard's Spots, a romance of the white man's burden, and followed it up in 1905 with The Klansman, an historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. Dixon's book was a massive bestseller in the Democratic South. A few years later, Dixon collaborated with another Democrat, the film producer D.W. Griffith, to make The Birth of a Nation. This was one of the first full-length motion pictures ever shown in the United States. Released in 1915, The Birth of a Nation caused a sensation with its dramatic scenes of ruthless Northerner carpetbaggers looting the poor, honest families of the South, as well as lusty black men preying with impunity on Southern maidens. In later interviews, Griffith said he modeled the hero of the story on his own father, who is depicted as heroically, if unsuccessfully, trying to uphold Southern gentlemanliness in the face of Northern barbarism. Interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln is portrayed favorably in the film. He is called the Great Heart, and the story implies that Reconstruction would have gone better had he remained in office. The villain of Griffith's story was a Northern politician named Austin Stoneman, who was modeled directly on the Republican abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens. The night-riding Klansmen were the film's heroes, finally taking on the Northern malefactors and protecting the honor of the South. The film made no reference to Republicans or Democrats. In a sense, Griffith was the original perpetrator of the progressive myth that party differences were inconsequential and that slavery and segregation were purely a North-South issue. The birth of a nation was strongly protested by Northern Republicans, such as Harvard President Charles Eliot and the feminist reformer Jane Addams, but also by Republicans in the South, such as the black educator Booker T. Washington. By contrast, the film was vigorously defended by Democrats across the country, including the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward White, who was a member of the original Ku Klux Klan. In the year of the film's release, the Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, arranged a private screening in the Oval Office for his cabinet and other invited guests. After the screening, Wilson declared that everything in The Birth of a Nation was accurate. In Wilson's words, "It's like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." The film inspired a Klan revival, spawning Klan chapters not only in the South, but also in the Midwest and the West. These clans featured men in white costumes with titles like Giant, Cyclops, and Grand Dragon, gathering together for vigils and cross-burnings and meetings known as Clonsiliums and Clonvocations. Wives, too, could participate in the Klan's sister organization, the Women's Division of the KKK. If there seems to be an element of theater in all these Klan rituals, a kind of perpetual Halloween for participants, the reality for blacks was grimmer. The new Klan focused its hate and violence against blacks, killing thousands over the course of 25 years. Between 1920 and 1925, Klan membership ranged between 2 to 5 million, making it one of the largest fraternal organizations in American history. Its members included governors of Texas, Indiana, and Oregon, as well as the mayors of several major cities and innumerable sheriffs, councilmen, and local judges. The Klan is often described as the face of Southern racism, but the group wasn't exclusively Southern. Rather, the Klan represented the racist face of the National Democratic Party. In the 50-year period starting from the Klan's founding through the late 1920s and early 1930s, every prominent Klan leader was a Democrat. In fact, Democrats were so prominent in the Klan that the group sometimes held its own primaries to decide which Klansman should receive the Klan endorsement in the upcoming election. And the Klan role was so central to the 1924 Democratic National Convention in New York that historians sometimes call it the Klan Bake. The Klan claimed to be devoted to justice, ensuring that blacks who propositioned or raped white women were punished through vigilante action. In reality, scholars of the Klan agree that much of the group's terrorism was aimed at keeping blacks socially subservient to whites, and also in preventing blacks from voting. To this end, Klansmen raided black workplaces, burned black homes, terrorized black families in nightly raids, and formed lynch mobs in an ongoing campaign of intimidation and terror. As a consequence of Klan mayhem, together with a series of democratic measures such as poll taxes and literacy tests, black voting declined precipitously throughout the South. The terrorist wing. Historians now recognize that the Klan wasn't going it alone. Rather, it was acting on behalf of the Democratic Party. As I argued earlier, the Democrats attracted poor whites by establishing a fixed racial caste system in which every white, no matter how degraded, had a higher social position than every black, no matter how educated or refined. The Klan was the enforcement mechanism of this inflexible racial hierarchy. The Klan also enforced a widely echoed Democratic Party mantra, which is that whites refuse to allow themselves to be governed by Negroes. This position required the suppression of the black vote, not because blacks were the majority in most states, but because white Democrats did not want any blacks to have a say in how they were governed. Today, this may seem to us like an expression of mindless racism, but the Democratic Party didn't see it that way. Democrats realized that the party's political dominance, mainly in the South but also in areas of the West and Midwest, relied on stopping blacks from voting. Black votes, after all, only undermined the Democrats and helped their opposition. In the half-century following the Civil War, the vast majority of blacks who voted did so for the GOP. The Democrats wanted to be the party of the white man, but they didn't want the Republicans to benefit from being the party that protected the rights of black people. The Democrats were determined to keep Republican influence out of the South, and after Reconstruction, they were largely successful in doing so. The Republicans watched in dismay as Democrats used their virtual monopoly in the South to visit terror and destruction upon a vulnerable black population. The Klan may have been the poster organization of Democratic racism, but it didn't operate by itself. The group's racial terrorism occurred and was legitimized within a political context in which racism was the accepted discourse of the Democratic Party. This was an era in which Democratic writers published books with titles like The Negro, a Beast, The American Negro as a Dependent, Defective, and Delinquent, The Negro, a Menace to American Civilization, and America's Greatest Problem, The Negro. The racist Democrats weren't just out in the culture writing books. They also served in the halls of the U.S. Congress. What does civilization owe to the Negro? The racist Democrat from Georgia, Tom Watson, once said. His answer, nothing. Watson was later elected to the U.S. Senate as a Democrat in 1920. Watson, a Klansman himself, deployed the Klan against his political enemies and advocated lynching blacks, Catholics, and non-white immigrants. When he died, his memorial service was organized jointly by the Ku Klux Klan and the Georgia Democratic Party. Another outspoken Democratic racist was James Vardaman of Mississippi, who served both as governor and then U.S. Senator. When Republican President Teddy Roosevelt agreed to have dinner with the distinguished black leader Booker T. Washington, Vardaman fumed, "I am just as opposed to Booker Washington with all his Anglo-Saxon reinforcements as I am to the coconut-headed, chocolate-colored, typical little coon Andy Dotson, who blacks my shoes every morning." Notice how Vardaman maintains the racial caste line so that poor whites among his constituents can feel superior even to Booker T. Washington. Another Democrat, Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina, offered an even more outrageous response. "Now that Roosevelt has eaten with that nigger, we shall have to kill 1,000 niggers to get them back to their place." That's how Democrats talked back then. They want us to forget about it now. We can see from Tillman's threat why Democrats needed and relied on the Ku Klux Klan. The party needed a domestic militia to carry out its racist projects of mayhem and murder. The segregation solution. In addition to the Klan, another institution of white supremacy that the Democrats created across the South was state-sponsored segregation. This took longer. While the Klan was in full operation in the 1860s, segregation was institutionalized in the 1880s and comprehensively established only by the early 20th century. The Democrats did it because they knew they could get away with it. By the 1890s, the Democrats had consolidated their power in the South, and the party was strong enough to prevent the federal government from intervening in the way it did during Reconstruction. Thus, Republicans in the North were limited in what they could do. Northern Republicans knew that they could not perpetually rule the South. At some point, the Southerners would have to govern themselves. In 1896, the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson affirmed the constitutionality of segregation. The court considered a Louisiana Railroad segregation statute that was euphemistically titled an act to promote the comfort of passengers. A Democratic legislature passed the law, and a Democratic governor signed it. Homer Plessy, a Republican who was 7/8 white, refused to sit in the railroad compartment reserved for blacks, and when he was cited for breaking the law, brought suit to challenge the constitutionality of the Louisiana statute. A largely, though not exclusively, Democratic Supreme Court upheld the law with the sole dissent coming from Justice John Harlan. Harlan famously stated that, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." Here, in the Republican tradition of Frederick Douglass, is a further affirmation of the colorblind ideal, more than half a century before King's Dreams speech. Harlan's dissent is justly famous. Less well known is the fact that he was a Kentucky Republican. Gradually, Democrats in the South segregated everything. Hotels, taverns, and inns were segregated. Schools were segregated, as were public water fountains. Prisons were segregated, as were public theaters, public libraries, and public parks. Hospitals, jails, and cemeteries were segregated. Movie theaters and opera houses were segregated, and also the professions. Black barbers could only cut the hair of other blacks. Black plumbers could only do repair work in black homes. Let there be no doubt about this. All the Jim Crow laws mandating segregation were enacted by Democratic legislatures and signed into law by Democratic governors. Democratic judges upheld those laws, and Democratic sheriffs and public officials enforced them. Segregation was solely and entirely the handiwork of the Democratic Party. The party may as well have adopted the motto of Democratic segregationist Governor George Wallace, who notoriously declared, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Over time, as racism became less defensible and fashionable, some Democrats insisted that segregation laws were not racist. Rather, they were neutral on their face. After all, segregation laws merely separated the black world from the white world while making no explicit statement about which one was better. This separate but equal argument was concocted way back in the late 19th century. A Democratic majority on the Supreme Court declared in the Plessy decision that if blacks feel inferior as a result of segregation, it's because they choose to view it that way, not because of anything in the law itself. Yet everyone, black and white, who lived under segregation knew that it was an instrument of white supremacy. Separate was not equal. No one knew this better than the Democrats. In fact, the Democrats counted on their white supporters to see it that way. The whole purpose of stamping the black race with inferiority was to enable the Democrats to confer privilege on their white constituents. Yet notice how Democrats consistently claimed that these mechanisms of exploitation were fair and just. The racist Democrat James Vardaman, speaking on the floor of the Senate, admitted that separate didn't actually mean equal, and went on to explain why blacks should not be given the same education as whites. Educating the black man simply renders him unfit for the work which the white man has prescribed. The only effect is to spoil a good field hand and to make an insolent cook. Segregation wasn't limited to the South. Following his election, Woodrow Wilson mandated segregation for all the agencies of the federal government. This had never happened before. In a sense, Wilson was burying the ghost of Lincoln, who would have been appalled beyond measure. The black community was apoplectic. Black leaders like Ida B. Wells and Monroe Trotter protested Wilson's racism, but the Democratic president was unmoved. Wilson indignantly told these black leaders that they had no reason to complain because segregation was in fact beneficial to blacks. Wilson also argued the argument from Plessy that segregation was just since whites were being separated from blacks just as much as blacks were being separated from whites. By now these themes should be familiar. Oppression is good for you, and it also promotes social justice. The Democrats had been down this road before. Recall that Andrew Jackson told the Indians that it was good for them that the government was taking their land. Jackson also insisted that his land confiscations were just, a term that he typically spelled with a capital letter. Of course, Knowing what we do about how Jackson and his cronies made off like bandits, we may be pardoned in sarcastically quipping that justice for Jackson actually meant just us. Today, too, Democrats make the same bogus claims when they exploit people by taking their money and turning them into second-class citizens. Naturally, Americans get upset about being demeaned and ripped off. The thieving Democrats then inform them that they should feel good about being stolen from because in this way they are being cured of greed, selfishness, and materialism. Democrats also justify their confiscations in the name of social justice. Now, as in the past, the Democratic Party counts on its victims to be suckers. The Progressive Lie. Summing up, we can see from this chapter that Hillary Clinton's arrogance before Senator Brooke was utterly misplaced. Brooke's indignation over the incident was completely justified. Brooke was actually the good guy, and Hillary's attempt to talk down to him was condescendingly racist. Of course, it was no more racist than Hillary's Democratic ancestors. But this is the point. Hillary was pretending to a different pedigree. She was basing her actions on a progressive narrative that is itself a lie. She was posing as the poster child for civil rights, while her actions and her party's actions qualify her as a poster child for white privilege and the degradation of blacks and other minorities. America doesn't have a long history of white supremacy. The Democrats do. Democrats are the party of racism, while opposition to racism came mainly from blacks and Republicans. From the Civil War onward, Republicans have been the party of equality and civil rights, while Democrats have been the party of racism and opposition to civil rights. Did that change? In the next chapter, we explore this question. Let me just say at this point that the answer will surprise you. For now, we can take it as established that the Democratic Party, through the dark night of slavery and the long period of racism and white supremacy, has been the systematic oppressor of blacks. Instead of demanding that blacks be grateful, what Democrats owe them is restitution and an apology.